The bank feeds in QuickBooks Online are one of the most powerful and worthwhile tools in your arsenal when it comes to running your small business. But it's really important to understand how our bank feeds interact with our accounts payable and accounts receivable to ensure that we aren't duplicating transactions or missing transactions. And to that end, I'm going to start today by doing a walkthrough of the accounts receivable cycle. All right, so we're going to walk all the way through what happens when you create an invoice, what reports this impacts, how you receive payments against invoices, and then finally, how you make sure that those payments are being received correctly so that they match up with what is coming through your bank feed. Okay, this means that you're not duplicating your income accounts on accident, and you're also making sure to mark invoices as paid when customers do submit those payments. So to that end, let's go ahead and get started. Now, first and foremost, in order to create an invoice, we go up here to the plus create button, and invoice is the first option under customers. So I click on that. Now, for this particular example, I'm going to be creating an invoice for a client named Elena Garcia, who is actually already in this particular training file that I use. So I'm going to put in her name. And as you can see, if I just start typing in her name, it will start to filter the options so I can more quickly and easily navigate to her. Now, with this, I am going to change the invoice date here because this is a transaction that I'm saying happened a little while in the past. So I'm going to say it was 12/01 of 25. Note, if I put in a 6-digit date code here, it's actually, when I hit tab, going to automatically fill in the rest of that for me. So that's very nice. From here, I would want to make sure that everything is showing up as I want it. Confirm that the correct terms are there, confirm that the invoice date is correct, and the due date is correct. Then I'm going to want to add the product and service. Now, setting up products and services is really its own separate item, and I will be doing a video about that at a later time to make sure that things are mapped to the correct income accounts, etc. But for today, I'm just going to use an account that I know, or an item that I know I already have here. So I'm going to say monthly bookkeeping, full service monthly bookkeeping, and the rate for this one is going to be $975. Okay, so if this is all of the information you need on your invoice, great. QuickBooks does have the option of adding other things. If you had unbilled charges or anything like that that you wanted to add, you could do that here. For the sake of this example, though, we're going to keep it very simple. So I've added all of this information. I have Elena Garcia's name in here. I have the product and service and the description as well as the rate to get me the total amount. I am now going to go ahead and just save this invoice. I don't need to send it to anybody, especially since the email that I have is a phony email. So now that that has been saved, this invoice is now on my books, okay? I would be able to view it if I went into my customer center and looked at Elena Garcia's customer profile. It would show as an outstanding transaction, and it will also show up on my accounts receivable aging summaries and details. So let's go ahead and actually check that out right now. If I go over to the side here and click on reports and then standard reports, and then check the who owes me and say accounts receivable aging summary, I will be able to see that I have an invoice right here for Elena Garcia for $975. Okay. We can see also that her total is actually $1,925 because I have another invoice of hers on the books. Now, you might be asking, what is this doing to my profit and loss? Well, if you run your business on a cash basis, having an invoice on the books is not going to do anything to your reports, okay? All it's going to do is show that this person owes you money if you look at an accounts receivable aging summary or detail report. However, if you run your books on accrual basis, you will see this $975 showing up in your income amount, whether or not that client has paid that invoice. So let's actually go ahead and look at that right now. I'm going to go back to standard reports right here. And then I'm going to click on profit and loss. And I'm going to say, instead of this year to date, I'm going to say last year, because that will include the period that contains this particular invoice. So I see I have bookkeeping services totaling $13,100. If I click into this, I will then get a detail of all of the transactions that make up that amount. And as we can see here, because I am on accrual basis, that $975 invoice that I entered for Elena Garcia is included here. Now, I want you to pay attention. When I click here and say cash instead of accrual, we can see that this report contains a lot fewer transactions. Both of the invoices for Elena Garcia and for Hugo Park disappeared because those invoices have not yet been recorded as paid. I have not shown that money coming into my bank just yet. Okay. So we've gone over a lot at this point. We're looking at how an invoice actually impacts our reports. We're going to continue to walk through this process and go a step further and look at what happens when we receive payment against an invoice and how we ultimately match that to the transaction that is coming through the bank feed. So let's say that Elena Garcia paid my invoice, okay? She paid that on, I think, we'll say the 7th of December. She paid that $975 invoice. I'll go back to the home screen and we're going to walk through how I would go about receiving that payment. I would go back to the plus create button and then select receive payment. From here, I can either search by invoice number if I happen to know or remember the invoice number, or I can search by customer. So if I type in Elena Garcia here, I can see there are 2 open invoices of hers on the books, okay? I'm going to go ahead and receive payment against this one. We can see that updated the amount to $975. Another thing that I would want to do here is I would want to make sure that I am reflecting the correct date that I received that payment, which was the 7th of December. And I would also want to make sure that it is being deposited into the correct account, okay? Now, where this can sometimes get a little bit complicated is if you receive multiple checks from customers, you might end up grouping those all into one deposit and depositing them into the bank. This is less common now, of course, with mobile deposit on apps, but it does sometimes still happen. So if you are grouping multiple payments together into one deposit that's going to show up in your bank account, you might opt to put that into undeposited funds right here, okay? And that will then allow you to group it together with other deposits and have it matched up. If you are unsure which account this amount was deposited into, you could also put it into undeposited funds, and then it will stay there until we find a match on our bank feeds for where that money flows through. So if you know for sure what account it's going to be deposited into, you can feel free to select that account here. If you're unsure, I recommend just saying undeposited funds, and that allows you to get it sorted out a little bit later on down the road. I'm going to go ahead and record and close this transaction. Now, what this has done is this has recorded that particular invoice as paid. Okay, so if I were to go back over to that accounts receivable report that we were looking at earlier, it would now show that that $975 has been paid and is no longer owed to me. Okay, so we can see here, Elena Garcia, that $975 is gone. It is only showing the $950 that she owes. Okay, likewise, if I were to run my reports on a cash basis or an accrual basis, I would be seeing that $975 as part of my income because I told QuickBooks that I received that money. All right, so we have now walked through what happens when we create an invoice, how it shows up on our reports, how we receive a payment, let's go ahead and look at the last piece of this puzzle, which is what we do on the bank feeds side, okay? Because bank feeds record all of this information. When we deposit a check, that comes through on our bank feed. And it is our responsibility to help QuickBooks match those up because we don't want to be duplicating our income numbers. So if I go into the bank feed here by clicking on bank transactions, and since we're looking at specifically the money in transactions, the deposits, I'm going to go ahead and filter by money in transactions. So what we see here happening are a couple of really cool things. First of all, we recorded that payment for $975 for Elena Garcia coming into our checking account. So that is showing up as a match, okay? It was deposited on 12/7 for $975 for Elena Garcia. Given that that matches the information over here, 12/7, and the name is Elena Garcia, and the dollar amount is $975, that would be a high confidence match. And I also did just record this particular deposit, and I knew that that was what I was recording. So I can go ahead and match this transaction. Now, it's important to match this transaction because otherwise QuickBooks doesn't necessarily know what transaction already on the books this corresponds to, if any, okay? Because not every transaction that flows through your bank feed is going to have a corresponding transaction in QuickBooks Online. So we're going to go ahead and match this. Now, one thing I want to call your attention to here is we have another possible match available, and it's another Elena Garcia payment, okay? That's great. So how would we identify whether or not this is accurate? Because you can see this one showed up a little bit differently. This is showing an invoice available that has a payment match, okay? Now, all that means is that I didn't go through the process of create new, receive payment, and record the payment. But QuickBooks sees that I received $950 from Elena Garcia around the time that this invoice was created, and it is suggesting that that invoice might be a match. If I know that invoice is a match, I can go ahead and match that transaction. If I'm not sure it is, I would want to leave it here until I have confirmed. Now, I know a lot of people will sometimes have recurring amounts that come up. So let's say that you consistently bill people for, say, $250. You would probably really want to make sure that you're matching the correct invoice to the correct $250 if you have 10 open invoices for $250. For this one, though, I don't have any other invoices open for that amount. And since the date and name are in the ballpark, I can go ahead and say that is a high confidence match and match that. Now, here is something I also want to address. On our accounts receivable reports, we had open invoices from Hugo Park, okay? But I can see right here that Hugo Park sent payments in my bank feed, all right? Now, what would we do about these particular transactions? Because we want to obviously match them up if they should be matched up with invoices, but we need a little bit of additional data. So let's say, for this particular example, that the client sent a remittance notice and they sent this payment for $825 and they were intending to pay an open invoice that was on the books for the amount of $875, but basically they did a typo, right? It's not at all uncommon for clients to accidentally pay an incorrect amount, and we have to be able to account for that. Well, I could do one of two things. I could either go create new, receive payment, and receive this $825 against the invoice that I know it corresponds to, or there's another thing that I can do to accomplish the same exact thing. I can click match right here in the bank feed, and that takes me to a list of invoices that are currently outstanding. And I can see right here, I have this outstanding invoice for $875 for Hugo Park. If I put a check mark right here, it is going to apply that $825 to that invoice. If I hit match, it is going to apply that payment to the invoice and show that there is still a $50 balance outstanding on that particular invoice. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to hit match. And let's go ahead and look at our accounts receivable report to see what that did. So again, who owes us? And accounts receivable aging summary. And we can now see that the invoice from Hugo Park went down from $875 to just $50. Now, I do want to call your attention to one other thing. The next payment that we received from Hugo Park was for $900. So at that point, again, hopefully they're sending us remittance notices so that we have backup for all of this. But at this point, I can assume that their next payment of $900 was in fact intended to pay the remaining $50 balance and the $850 balance that was due next. So with that knowledge, I can go back into bank transactions. I can look at that particular deposit and I can say match. And then I can not only match this transaction right here, which we can see since the open balance is only $50, it's only going to let me apply $50 to that invoice. It's also showing that I still have an $850 difference to resolve before I can match this transaction. So I can then check off this other transaction, and now my difference to resolve is 0. And that $900 payment is now going to be applied against those two existing transactions. Once I do this, that payment is going to be added from my bank register. It's not going to be showing, I'm sorry, not my bank register, my bank transactions feed. It's not going to be showing it there anymore. It will have been moved into my bank register. And if I do one final check of the report, I'm going to see that the amount for Hugo Park has now disappeared. So I don't have any more, Hugo Park does not owe me any further money at this point. Okay. So that is basically kind of a longer form walkthrough of what we are doing when we are creating invoices in QuickBooks Online, how those impact all of our reports, how we receive payments against them, and finally, how we make sure that those payments or those open invoices are matching up with the transactions that come through on our bank feed. If we were to not go through this process correctly, we might end up classifying deposits on our bank feed as income to us. And if we happen to be working with accrual basis accounting, that might actually cause us to accidentally duplicate our income. And let me tell you, that's never a fun place to be. It also means that we can't rely on our accounts receivable reports if we aren't going through this process and ensuring that we're marking those invoices as paid. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am Holly from Accrual Mistress Bookkeeping and Consulting. If you have any questions on this process, please feel free to leave those below. I'd be happy